Hello everyone, hopefully you're watching this video. This is the recording of my lecture that I was going to give for Monday. In lieu of that, we're going to watch a film starting on Monday. I'll explain what we're going to do. We're going to do a little exercise involved with that. And so the lecture today is entitled Industrial America. And it's about the rise of modern industry in the United States, but also the rise of labor conflicts that go along with that. And we're going to begin today's lecture talking about, and you'll see in the slides I had a leaf for you on D2L, about an execution. On June 21st, 1877, there was a big media event as 6 men were sent to the gallows in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania. All 6 men were Irish immigrants, and they were all hanged for murder in the coal fields of Pennsylvania. According to the people that had prosecuted them, they were members of a secret organization called the Molly Maguires, which was an organization of Irish Catholic immigrants who, according to them, wanted to, kill off basically any of their bosses who wouldn't give them jobs or wouldn't give them rises in pay. And again, eventually, about 20 men would eventually be executed as part of this secret organization of Molly Maguires. And it made headlines all across the country. One Philadelphia newspaper, quote, said about them, of their execution, they thanked the country for, quote, deliverance from as awful a despotism of banded members as the world has ever seen in any age, unquote. And it's true there had been violence in the coal fields of Pennsylvania from basically the end, maybe even before the end of the Civil War, growing in intensity up through the 1870s. Somewhere between 20 and 24, mine foremen and superintendents had been murdered in Pennsylvania's mining district in the 1870s and 1873. Pinkerton's detective agency, a very famous one, began sending men at the behest of railroad companies and coal companies into these fields and reporting rumors about the existence of the Molly Maguires, a band of rough who joined together for the purpose of exacting revenge for anyone they may have taken a dislike to. So you have these conflicting accounts of what they did. Eventually what happens is they hire the railroad companies a detective named James McParland, who was also an Irish Catholic immigrant, to infiltrate the Molly Maguires and basically bring them to justice, so-called. What is interesting about this incident is that many headlines as it generated, and by the way, when I say violence, I mentioned the deaths of mine superintendents. There was also violence between workers because the Irish immigrants clashed with English immigrant and Welsh immigrant workers in the same industries, coal industries especially. And there were vigilantes who were anti-union who would go and beat them up. And so you have a lot of this is tied in with unions. One of the things that's interesting about this, however, is that almost all modern historians see this trial as a corruption of justice. Why? Because the acting prosecuting attorney in the case was actually the head of the Reading Railroad Company. Reading Railroad Company and Coal Company, who were trying to prosecute, who actually hired the Detective Agency in the first place to go investigate these Molly Maguires. And in fact, the only testimony that convicted these 20 men was on the say-so of James McParland, who was hired by that company. And in fact, modern historians have examined this. They know precious little about these actual Irish immigrants. We know they were actually members of a working men's association, which came from Ireland, called the Ancient Order of Hibernians. And all the members of the Molly Maguires who were executed were members of this organization. But we have no idea, by the way, what their motives were, other than the say-so of James McParland and these people who were totally compromised, obviously. And in fact, there are some historians who go so far as to argue that they never existed, that the organization was made up by these railroad companies. Partly why, and why make this up, by the way, to discredit unions. They were concerned about unions organizing in the coal fields of 1870s Pennsylvania. And it's a fascinating story. I'll come back to this at the end of the lecture. But I introduced the topic here just to give you an idea of what it was like when America industrialized. It took a lot of effort. It took, conflict, basically. There are some 3,700 strikes that occur, I believe, between 1877 and 1900. It's in my notes somewhere. I'll come back to it. Between 1877 and 1914, in which somewhere between 200 and 300 people die. So this is violent conflict. And it involves organized labor. It also involves the rise of modern corporations as we understand them, and their efforts to create a national market. You remember that's kind of the genesis. That's kind of the goal of the Reconstruction later on Republican Congresses. And they do that, but it sort of brings out a natural reaction, which is the organization of labor against a lot of their practices. And also involved in all this, and I'll come back to the end of the lecture as well, is immigration. Because, again, part of the reason that this is done, the creation of this national economy, is to compete globally. And you're going to have the bringing in of workers, and the Irish are part of that pattern to staff these new corporations, which begin, by the way, again, the railroads are the heartbeat of a lot of this change. And so these are three things that really are in the background of a lot of what goes on in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s when the labor movement comes into existence in a national sense. And I showed you a picture on the slides of a destroyed mine, dynamited mine, 1894. Again, mining operations were really brutal. They were kind of deadly sort of work. And sometimes, of course, you have people who know how to use dynamite. They use it. That's what's going to happen in these labor disputes. And it will, and by the way, it will frighten this labor conflict. Will frighten middle class America. They don't like it. They don't like it when there are strikes, when there are, work stoppages and stuff like this. And again, it's something you've never had to live with. You're all too young to remember. Unions have been broken, but it was a serious set of conflicts over a serious set of issues that brought this about. So I wanted to emphasize that in this lecture. But begin with modern industrialization. Again, industrialization actually begun, just to be clarified, before the Civil War in America. But the second wave of it's really the stuff that makes America a giant, economically speaking. The scale of it and the scope of it is so large. It takes on, it really does reshape the country in a lot of ways. And America was becoming an industrial power. And not only because it had advantages of, natural resources, water, people, land, coal, oil later on, but also because American businesses made innovations that made us predominant, which still exist to this day. And they can be traced back to several individuals, too. It's kind of interesting. The person who's most responsible for this was originally a cattle buyer named Gustavus Swift. He's the one who pioneered the concept of vertical integration. And what this means basically is you have a firm, a business, in which all of its functions are handled under one roof, basically, from processing to distribution, basically. And so what we think of as a corporation, where they do everything in-house under one structure. He also utilized things like, he was the first person basically invented the assembly line, where instead of making one product, you make one piece of it at a time. This, along with predatory pricing, aimed at pushing out his competitors and absorbing them, made him very rich. And it was very important because it was an essential step on the way to creating that mass market and that national market that these corporations, and as well as the federal government, had wanted to create it since before the Civil War. Along with vertical integration was the other concept pioneered by John D. Rockefeller, his company Standard Oil, of horizontal integration to create a national distribution system for his oil. He made deals with railroad executives. He intimidated rivals to merge with him, so they had no choice because he had a share of the market. And in particular, Rockefeller's lawyers created a new legal form called the trust. And what a trust basically was, you charge a small group of people to hold stock from several different companies and manage them as one. And so this is, again, when we think of corporate America or corporations, this is what we're talking about, basically. And this basically concentrates ownership in a handful of businesses. By 1895, Standard Oil has basically monopolized 95% of the oil capacity in the United States. By 1900, America's largest 100 corporations controlled 1/3 of the nation's productive capacity. And this is what will lead, by the way, later on to calls for reform in the 20th century. But it leads to this just getting really big and dominating the country this way. At the same time, this creates this national market, a national consumer culture. Things like retail go through big changes. This is where you get the invention of mail order houses. Montgomery Ward's, Sears and Roebuck establish mail order chains in order to reach rural customers. Again, it's not just the idea of you're uniting the country in terms of, okay, we're going to go coast to coast now. You're also going to reach areas that have never been reached before because they were too far away. Again, tapping into untapped markets within the country itself. You also have the pioneering in 1875 of the department store. Again, the idea that you have everything under one roof to buy, basically, a concept developed at the same time. Bigger scale, more stuff, putting it all under one roof, as well as chain stores for the first time, national chains like Woolworths. And going along with all this, of course, if you're going to have national stuff, you have to advertise for it. And this is when advertising becomes a huge business. By 1900, companies were spending over $90 million a year in advertising space in newspapers and magazines. And by 1900, you had, as a result, about 1,200 mail order companies, with the biggest subscribers, Ladies' Home Journal, having 3 million subscribers by 1903. So massive scale, massive advertising budgets for this. What also changed was the corporate workplace itself. It's the last part of this slide. Before the Civil War, again, I think I mentioned this before in my lectures, I don't know which one. Most people before the Civil War had worked for themselves. They'd been small farmers, they may have owned a small business out of their own home, or they may have been independent craftsmen, basically. Essentially, they were used to working for themselves. One of the big things that happens after the Civil War is they become, for the first time by the 1870s, to work for other people for the most part. And this is sometimes bound up with the rise of corporations, what's sometimes called the managerial revolution, where you have a whole new class of workers that you didn't have before. This is white-collar workers, bureaucratic types, accountants, stuff like this, who are differentiated from blue-collar workers who work on the shop floor. Again, by the shirts they wore, by the way. It separates you from each other in that regard. And almost without exception, the biggest firms that were created initially after the Civil War were drawing on the model that was established by the railroads. This is, again, you have headquarters of a major corporation housing everything within it, and you have departments, supervised by middle managers. Again, middle management was something that didn't exist before the Civil War. And so you have this rise in this managerial class, again, becoming a more and more important part of what companies do. At the same time, with the standardization of production, as technology increased, workers began to lose their independence even more, because before, of course, you're making one whole product. You're an independent craftsman. You would make one product by hand. Now, of course, you're just making bits and pieces of things. As one worker complained in the 1880s, quote, "I cannot be master of a craft, but only master of a fragment," unquote. This is sometimes called the de-skilling of labor forces. And along with this, you also had efforts by business owners to squeeze more productivity out of their workers. There was a belief that you could reduce costs by getting employees to work harder and more efficiently. This idea was pioneered by a man named Frederick Taylor, who called his strategy scientific management. And literally this meant people, supervisors, whatever shop foreman or whatever standing over workers as they worked with a stopwatch, seeing how fast they could produce whatever it was they were supposed to produce. And if they met the stopwatch standard, they got more money. And the thing that Taylor assumed, which was wrong, was that the only thing that mattered to workers was more money, and they would automatically respond. For the most part, they hated it with a passion, as you can kind of obviously kind of get that idea. Kind of is very awful, actually, in many ways. And one of the other things that happened in all this was that increasingly, as production became de-skilled, factory workers especially came to include more and more women, but also children. Who again, mostly because you could pay them less because they were women and children. Women's presence was often resented by the men, and later on you will also begin to have, as children are used more and more, you're going to have labor unions speaking out against that especially. As well, one of the things you have to remember about this, and again, immigrants, African Americans, they tend to be at the bottom of this pay scale, is the other thing, below Native workers and below white workers. And this is hardly, by the way, limited to the South in terms of African Americans. It's pretty much the standard everywhere, discrimination on that basis. And it's hard work. That's the other thing to mention here. One of the things is that labor unions really are fighting for throughout the end of the 19th century is limitation to the workday. They work it's standard to work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week in late 19th century America. There's little or no regulation for safety purposes. If you die on the job, you're injured, you can't work, that can mean literally the starvation of your family. And particularly as there are a couple of major depressions in the 1870s and 1890s. And just to give you an idea, and also some of these injuries are highly dangerous. The steel industry, coal industry are very dangerous. 25% of immigrant steel workers died or disabled in the Pennsylvania steel industry. Some 2,000 workers a year died in the coal mines of Pennsylvania. That's pretty amazing numbers. So we're not talking about, we think of modern labor, they have lots of protections. They don't have that at the end of the 19th century. And so just to show you, the next slide is the increase of gross domestic product and the dropping of prices. Again, you do have, this works. The creation of the national market works. It creates a lot of money. It creates a lot of new products people can buy. But of course, this happens unequally, and a lot of people are shut out. They can't afford it. This is working class people mostly. And it comes at a cost. And the next picture, you show a picture of two child laborers, almost certainly under, probably 15 years old, look like they're about 10 or 12, something like that. And again, it's a glass factory. It's nasty. It's dirty. It's cluttered. It's dark. It shows you some of the conditions people worked in and the reason why they're so. This could breed such passions, to my point. This is the reason why you're willing to fight people, beat the hell out of them, maybe in certain instances kill them. It really is in the matter of life or death for some people sometimes. And this leads to the emergence of the modern labor movement, because you have this problem being nationalized, because the economy is being nationalized, as it were. And by the way, you'd had trade associations before the Civil War. They were mostly limited to big cities in the Northeast, because that's where industrialization started. They go national in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. And in general, there were two strategies labor advocates could adopt. One was trying to build a broad political alliance to put their problems before Congress, get legislation passed. Or secondly, they could avoid politics altogether and try to narrowly focus on trade unions and negotiate directly with employers for improvements, higher wages, all that stuff. And up to the early 1890s, the first strategy was the more predominant one. And this begins, by the way, in earnest, gets into the American consciousness, especially in 1877, not just because of the Molly Maguire, but also there was a major, massive, for the first time, national strike, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Workers in I can't remember how many cities walked off the job in 1877, and they were confronted by, for the first time, the National Guard, which I should mention, by the way. National Guard units were actually established for the purposes of putting down strikes. And this railroad strike was a catastrophe in terms of human life. 100 people were killed in the process. And after the strike was over, because again, there's a depression on there, they were protesting wage cuts and things of this nature. Many wearable workers were fired or blacklisted afterward. And I should mention, by the way, most people were not on the side of the workers. Most middle class people were frightened by this. To give you an idea of why, it portended for them a potential revolution. In 1871, in France, when the monarchy, the empire of Louis Napoleon collapsed, there was a workers' revolt in Paris, and the workers took over the city, basically, tried to take over the country, and established what they called a commune in 1871. For several months, they basically barricaded the city off. They actually had to send French military troops into Paris in 1871 to put this down, and it was violent and bloody and brutal. And so this sort of thing frightened people. One of the things I need to mention about the context about all this is that there are across Europe, there's a lot of turmoil, more so in America. There's never a workers' revolution, of course, in the United States. You will have those sorts of things, attempts at them in Europe, and of course, this is the age in which, and we'll come to this in a moment, the ideas of Karl Marx are becoming prominent in Europe, and these ideas, they will migrate to America. Eventually, it will have some impact. There will be a small American Communist Party, which I think still exists, if I'm not mistaken. And so people are frightened by this when they see this in the newspapers. And so what labor unions do to overcome this is they will eventually wind up allying with agrarian advocates, farmers' advocates. And these are interesting types because they're going to lead to, later on, when you get to the latter part of the end of the century, the emergence of the Populist Party, which we'll get to next time. But they are, these agrarian advocates, basically big critics of two things. One, government tariffs, and then two, the government alliance with companies like the railroads. Why? Because they think of themselves as being at the mercy of these farmers of large corporations. They think these tariffs hurt small farmers. And again, they especially dislike, by the way, middlemen, middle managers, shippers, equipment dealers, bankers, lawyers, people like that. They really think they're trying to screw them, basically. In other words, they are directly attacking the whole plan of economic nationalization that's been favored by the government since the Civil War. And so what happens is you have the first of these agrarian protest groups being founded in 1867, the National Grains of the Patrons of the Husbandry, sometimes called the Grangers. And again, they sought to counter this new middle management through cooperation and mutual aid societies. In fact, in the 1870s, they actually formed a national political party, the Greenback Labor Party. And the Greenbackers, I should say, adhere to the ideal they called producerism. They basically believe that producers shared common goals. This should unite them against, again, the middlemen, bankers, lawyers, investors, people who lived off the sweat of their labor, basically. They wanted things like, again, reduced working hours, but also corporate regulation. This will be a big theme going forward eventually when it does happen in the 20th century. And they had some success. Greenback labor candidates won over 1 million votes and elected 15 congressmen in 1878. By the 1880s, 29 states had actually created railroad commissions to supervise railroad rates and policies. Other states formed commissions to regulate the insurance industry and utility companies. And so by the 1890s, you also had states passing antitrust laws to prevent monopolies. So you do have a push that works. You do have some effectiveness in terms of this at a state level, not necessarily at a federal one. But the real emergence of a big-time labor movement starts with the Knights of Labor, which was founded as a secret organization in 1869. Again, I mentioned this secret organization stuff. I mentioned the Molly Maguires may not have existed, but secret organizations did exist, and partly sometimes for good reasons. Labor unions could be illegal in some places. But also you had, again, I go back to the global context for this, in Europe, you did have secret societies of people like anarchists who went around assassinating people. So there's this shady sort of underground that sort of exists in the 1890s and 1880s. I wouldn't overdo it, however. People at the time, I think, did. I think they blew it up to a too great an extent. But they were there. However, however small the numbers would have been. But in any case, the Knights of Labor began to develop into a national movement in the 1870s. And there was an overlap, by the way, between the Greenback Party and the Knights of Labor. A lot of people had the same members. And the Knights had originally been intended to set up what was called a cooperative commonwealth of factories owned and run by employees. The leader was a man named Terence Powderly, who, among other things, also advocated temperance. And again, the Knights of Labor were very much a sort of patriotic organization. They based their critique of industrialization on things like the Declaration of Independence and the Bible. They appealed to religion, if you can imagine this. And by the early 1880s, the Knights began to eventually act more like trade unions, striking, demanding better wages, stuff like this. And one of the things that made them very successful is they combined both skilled and unskilled workers within their movement. This is important because, again, that skilled and unskilled workers, first of all, they have different interests, but second of all, skilled workers have much more leverage vis-a-vis employers, of course. They combined them into a fairly highly decentralized sort of movement, which I should mention, by the way, was fairly inclusive for the most part. Blacks, I think women were also allowed, not Chinese. Again, we'll come back to immigration in a second. And so by the middle of the 1880s, they were beginning to have some success. One of their big goals was trying to get an 8-hour workday, trying to regulate child labor, get rid of it, again, for corporate regulation. And so they've been calling for a series of strikes when, in 1886, in Chicago, when outside of Haymarket Square, where people were gathered for a strike, an incident occurred which was blamed on anarchists who advocated a stateless society. And Chicago was a hotbed of anarchism in the 1880s and 90s, if you can imagine. And the incident, by the way, somebody threw a bomb into a crowd, which killed several policemen, several civilians. I think it was only 6 or 7 people that died. And four anarchists were arrested. And were actually 5, I should say. 4 were executed, 1 committed suicide, and others were arrested, received long prison sentences. As a result of this, people blamed the Knights of Labor for their strikes for this occurrence. And eventually, this set off a sort of anti-union hysteria, which damaged the Knights' reputation badly. Their membership dropped by 20% in the 4 years following the Haymarket bombing. And employers struck back. They would break strikes. They would bring in National Guard, bring in their own people. Literally, break strike means you go out and, with clubs and beat the hell out of the strikers. They'd compile blacklists. They would do the things they normally do, force workers to renounce union membership and stuff like this, which led to its decline. You also have one last gasp, by the way, of this more political approach to labor disputes with the Cooperative Alliance of the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, in which you have farmers in Texas and elsewhere banding together to try to establish cooperative stores and exchanges that would circumvent, again, middlemen, shippers, people like this. They would gather farmers' orders and buy in bulk and at wholesale prices and pass those savings on to farmers. Again, this didn't work. Cooperatives suffered from underfunding. They lacked credit. Again, if you don't like banks, it's kind of hard to get credit. And they faced hostility, of course, from the merchants, the banks they were trying to circumvent. And what happens is that, again, you're having things like cotton prices. They collapse in the 1890s. This makes it fall. And they did eventually they had some sort of success with this. There were laws passed. The alliance between these, the Cooperative Alliance did push for some changes along with the Knights of Labor. Congress in 1887 passed an act for federal funding for agricultural research. Particularly the Interstate Commerce Act, which was passed, was also a direct pressure from Labor Farm Alliance of Farm and Labor, like the Cooperative Alliance. And basically it was meant to sort of regulate the railroads, essentially. The new law, unfortunately, forbade railroads from reaching. The new law forbade railroads from reaching secret setting agreements. That is, say, doing what people like Rockefeller had done, making secret agreements to get good rates so you can drive out competition. And again, it didn't. Powers were kind of limited to a certain degree partly by other things, but it was the beginning. It would be used later on to regulate corporations. And in particular, this is the last thing to mention about the Cooperative Alliance. Its members would be the ones who initially found the Populist Party in the 1890s. We'll come to that, I say, next time. The other major strategy labor advocates employed was that of the American Federation of Labor, and their strategy was different. They shut a closed shop. They reserved jobs only for union members, and they mostly involved skilled laborers, printers, molders, iron workers, et cetera, nationwide. And so they were opposed to what the more sort of broad approach of the Knights of Labor. And they advocated what one of their leaders, Samuel Gompers, called pure, simple unionism. What that meant was pure in the sense it was limited totally to workers, because there's no politics involved, and too simple. It's focused on immediate, achievable goals. In particular, indirect negotiation with companies themselves. Again, getting pay raises, getting for better hours, stuff like this. Samuel Gompers thought the Knights of Labor had focused too much on politics, so there's a turning away from this. And in terms of achieving its goals, it worked. The AFL was very small, but as the Knights of Labor declined, more and more people began to join the union, and so membership rose to about over 2 million by 1904. It was basically the leading labor association by the early 20th century. And besides being limited to mostly skilled craftsmen, it was basically shut out minorities of any kind, essentially. And so it did have success, again, making gains for skilled workers, again, not so much for unskilled laborers. And again, that would of necessity include a lot of women, a lot of African Americans, and other minorities. Something, by the way, that will come to bite to a certain degree, the labor movement in the 20th century. And there I show you, by the way, a picture of Karl Marx, probably because it's a great picture, big bushy beard. I show that also to illustrate that the labor movement and the creation of a global power, the United States was part of a global exchange, not just of workers and goods and everything. They were part of a global movement of ideas, because Marx's ideas were popular a lot of places. I mentioned that. Even though they never had much purchase in the United States, there will be some influence among working men's parties in the 20th century from Marxist ideas. The Soviet Union will definitely have an influence on this in the 1930s especially. But he's there. His influence is always there, and people are, of course, petrified of his ideas, because he supports not just the overthrow of capitalism, he supports the violent overthrow of it. So it's always in the background of people's minds. I have to reiterate that when we discuss this stuff. But finally, what is America's place in this global economy? Well, it begins basically to become the industrial giant of the world. Just to give you a comparison, in 1860, the United States was behind Germany, France, and the United Kingdom in output, industrial output. By 1890s, it outpaced its closest competitor, Germany, by double the output. So it was doubling its greatest competitor by the end of the century. Pretty amazing. Part of the reason for this was the increase in population. Again, people knew once the country, foreign observers, people in Europe knew once the United States overcame the Civil War, it was going to become a power. And so it's increased population, as well as immigration. Again, you have a tax base to draw on. Something also, by the way, that helped Germany when Germany united, it became a big, population-wise after 1871. And like Germany, we had natural resources that made this possible. And again, I mentioned before the new the new management styles of American business, they were not really quickly adopted in most European countries. Places like the United Kingdom and France, for example, had a long tradition of family firms, and they tended to predominate well into the 20th century. They didn't like the idea of corporations, and partly, by the way, this is because France and the UK are kind of old aristocratic countries. They're used to having, things handed down by the family, and so it existed a lot longer. Again, in some place like Britain, for example, if you make good in business, your goal is to rise up the social ladder. How do you do that? Well, you don't keep reinvesting in your company. You make a big company, then you buy some land, become a gentleman farmer, maybe marry into the aristocracy and become a duke, or not a duke, but you become a gentleman, a part of the nobility, lower in the nobility. At least that's the goal for a long, long time. And even after that begins to die out, into the 19th century, you still have a few noble families left. Again, you don't do the same thing you would do, because in America there's none of that. You just reinvest in your company, which will make money. The one nation, by the way, that did adopt American standards of business was Germany. And again, Germany was with many different countries before it became one state. Even though it had, their aristocratic families in Germany, they very much saw themselves as a modern nation state. They thought of themselves as a progressive sort of society. I know that sounds backward in our mind, knowing what we do about Germany in the 20th century. That's not how they saw themselves at the end of the 19th century. And they did adopt American styles of business, partly a reason for their success. And in fact, many workers' unions in Europe would copy the organization, particularly of the Knights of Labor. And we had a lot of links between labor groups in the United States and in Europe. Again, most especially, there's German links, people coming from Germany influenced by Marx and stuff like that, but also from Ireland. And so things like, interchange of labor spread those ideas as well. So this is part of a global network. One of the interesting things, of course, is that European workers were much better able to get concessions from governments in Europe. Germany in the late 19th century actually pioneered things like sickness insurance and old age pensions for workers, as did later on France and Britain. Britain's Labour Party came into existence in 1900. Whereas we, of course, have never had a true Labour Party in this country, although the Democratic Party was the representative of that here. And this is partly because you have, in places like France and the United Kingdom, again, these are older aristocratic societies. They're used to treating their people paternalistically, in other words. But also, of course, because in these places, there's much more likelihood of revolution, so they need to placate workers in a much more direct way than the American governments had to. And so you have this becoming, part of this global network. You also have new patterns of immigration emerging. And America will experience a huge upsurge between 1877 and run up to World War I. Between 1877 and 1900, 11 million immigrants entered the United States. And between 1900 and 1914, another 13 will enter. So nearly 25 million immigrants will enter the country by World War I. In 1900, census takers found that over 75% of all residents of San Francisco and New York City had at least one parent who were foreign-born. This obviously hit the coastal cities much bigger than anywhere else for obvious reasons. And of course, immigrants were partly welcome because they were an ideal labor supply. That is to say, they were cheap and disposable. They were disposable partly because they would take jobs at low pay. And during economic downturns, they would actually leave the labor market and return to the countries of their origins. And so, again, big corporations naturally tended to favor them. And so in the decades that follow, you had, and I should mention when you say new immigration, what's different about it? Earlier immigration had come mostly from Northwestern Europe, Ireland, Britain, England, Germany for the most part, and Scandinavia, some places like this. What changes in the 1880s, 90s, and the early part of the 20th century is that it shifts. It starts coming from southern and southeastern Europe, especially. Italians in large numbers, Greeks here, but especially Eastern European Jews from places like Poland and Russia arrive in large numbers. About 3 million Jewish immigrants arrive from Russia Ukraine, Poland, and other parts of Europe by the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. All immigrants face some level of discrimination. Probably the worst discrimination was directed toward the Chinese. The first Chinese immigrants had actually come to the United States in the 1840s during the California Gold Rush. However, the first treaty is signed in 1868 between the United States government and the Chinese Empire, which established quotas for letting Chinese into immigrate to America for the first time. I may have mentioned this in my last lecture, specifically for the purpose of providing workers out west, both in the railroad companies, but also for the mining companies in the West, where they faced severe discrimination and persecution. Native workers didn't like the fact they were bringing in these immigrants to work and take their jobs. And again, this is a dynamic that still exists today. Big companies like cheaper labor. Once workers start to organize, start to demand better wages, they will bring in other people to sort of replace them. And this is kind of where you get, and you read the major problems reader for this week that I assigned. There are a couple of examples of this, examples of prejudice against Chinese workers, which is pretty interesting. So much so that even in 1868, which, by the way, one of the interesting things about the Burlingame Treaty is for the first time it gave really sweeping powers to federal officials. Immigration was for the first time made illegal. It hadn't been regulated that much before this. And again, it's done for the purposes of bringing in labor. By the 1880s, people were out. There's such an outcry against the Chinese. They passed the first of the so-called Chinese Exclusion Acts in 1882, limiting Chinese immigration in the United States. They'll actually be strengthened. They'll actually pass more, add more restrictions into the 20th century. Won't be repealed in the 1940s. Very, very interesting the way this works. And so you have this reaction against foreign-born laborers, both for racial and ethnic reasons, prejudice that way, but also because of economic ties. And this all sort of comes together in what we call nativism. This is the last part that I need to mention here. This new immigration set off a wave of anti-immigrant, but also there was also a weird sort of religious element to this. Anti-Catholic sentiment. Again, lots of Irish coming over. Anti-Jewish sentiment to a certain degree. More so anti-Catholic prejudice to a large degree. And so you had a series of so-called Blaine Amendments passed at the end of the 19th century. Blaine Amendments were state amendments to state constitutions that tried to outlaw private schools, what they called sectarian schools, and that was code word for Catholic schools, because they were worried these new Catholic immigrants wouldn't want to assimilate into white, Protestant Anglo-Saxon American, culture, basically. You also have a series of, associations being formed, things like the American Protective Association, which, again, people are swearing oaths and stuff like this to keep out Catholics and stuff like this at the end of the 19th century. And so you have this, again, it's almost say natural, but you have this, reaction to, which almost comes about in the wake of all this. As the United States, of course, becomes this great industrial power, it sets off a new set of conflicts. Like you went from the Civil War, so you had, sectional conflict now you have national conflicts within the country between labor and capital, but also now between native and non-native workers. And so it's a time of real strife when America becomes a major global power. I'm going to talk about the maps just for a little bit. Actually, I have maps in the slide. Number of immigrants per decade in the United States. You can see where most of the immigration comes from. Early on, again, mostly from Northwestern Europe, Germany, England, Ireland. Later on, it switches. Lots from Russia, lots from Italy, still from Germany and Britain, but also from Austria as well. So you have people from the eastern parts of Europe coming to the United States. And the last chart to show you just shows you where immigrants are going. British immigrants, most of these places, the destination is the United States. That's one thing to keep in mind. Immigrants are going everywhere in the 19th century, to Australia, to Canada, to places like that, to South America. But as you can see there, 55% of Italian immigrants, they go to the United States. 50% of British immigrants go to the United States. 95% of German immigrants go to the United States. 100% of Swedish immigrants go to the United States. So it's the place to be. So it really becomes, I could say a diverse country, if you want to put it that way, for the first time. It also becomes severely saturated with conflict as a result of all this. So it's kind of interesting. As the country becomes one powerful nationalized economy, national markets, national distribution centers, national advertising, all that stuff, it also becomes, ethnically and religiously, baffling diverse, and it causes conflict for both of those reasons. And the last, I just give you the basic points I wanted to emphasize about, patterns of immigration, division between labor and capital, the modern national economy, those sorts of things. And so, one last thing before I end this little lecture. You're going to be, I mentioned you're going to be watching a film on Monday. And so, what the film is, basically, it's about, ta-da, the Molly Maguires. It was a film made back in the 1970s, so it's old. You probably won't recognize any of the actors. You might recognize Sean Connery. You may know who Sean Connery is. Old white guy, old Scottish guy. And he plays the leader of this group, the Molly Maguires. Sean Connery, who has that wonderful all-purpose Gaelic accent, can be Scottish, can be Irish, probably do Welsh too. Could do a Russian Scottish accent if you've ever seen The Hunt for Red October. And if you don't think Russian is a Gaelic language, you've never heard Sean Connery try to speak it. So, but no, seriously, it's actually a fine film. And what we're going to do for Monday and Wednesday, I'm going to watch hopefully the whole movie if we can get away with this. I'm going to provide you, I haven't put them on there yet, with D2L, a couple of sheets in which I'm going to have you watch the film, but break down the film. You have to mark down some things about the film as you watch in terms of what, as we're going to see, what filmmakers do. Because this is an exercise I'm calling How to Watch an Historical Film. So, and I'll explain this in further detail in class tomorrow, but things like, who's the main character? Who are the main characters? What are their goals, throughout the entire film? Does the film have a 3-act structure? Those sorts of things. Well, I'll discuss this in more detail in a moment. Partly so to get you to identify those points in the film where, when you watch movies, you get the sense that, okay, the filmmaker might be making this up. Why? Because there are certain needs that films have. They're going to be marketed to a wide audience, right? And so the second thing I'm going to have you do is you're going to do that as you watch the film. I also want you to mark down where you think, okay, where is this? Does this seem accurate? The accuracy of the film. I'll have, again, more specific questions. You'll see what this is on Monday. And again, it's not like this is a foolproof process, but to give you a sense of, a skill you like. If you're watching a movie, okay, I can see, okay, this is what filmmakers do. This is where they might have altered the history a little bit, because they need to make it a little more exciting to try to sell the movie, or where they're taking advantage of. And again, the story of the Molly Maguires is great because we don't know that much, and a lot of it depends on very, very questionable, evidence and everything. And so that's what we're going to be doing, and we'll discuss this on Friday. We'll talk about the film, and we'll also talk about more general things, but I thought we'd do that kind of a fun little thing with movies. And if this works out very well, we'll probably do this at least once more the rest of the semester, so we'll see how this goes. So it's my lecture on the Industrial America. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Take care, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend.